Right, to item 8, the Shoreline Adaptation Plan for Waimanalo, Little Shoal Bay. So I think Natasha and Paul are coming up, and if you want to briefly introduce yourselves and maybe the team behind you, if you'd like to just acknowledge them, and then we'll go through the presentation. Thank you.
Ata Marie, thank you all for your time. Ko Paul Kleinek toku ingoa. I'm the General Manager for the Resilient Land and Coast Department of Auckland Council. What I propose that we do today, I'm going to pass over to Natasha Carpenter, who's our Coastal Management Practice Lead. She'll introduce the broader project team. Obviously a lot of work going into this Shoreline Adaptation Plan and the future Shoreline Adaptation Plans before we run you through a supporting presentation and receive any questions that you might have. Kia ora.
Morena koutou, ko Natasha Carpenter toku ingoa. I'm the Coastal Management Practice Lead in Resilient Lands and Coasts, and it's our pleasure to be here today to seek approval of the Waimanalo Little Shoal Bay mini SAP. And I'd just like to acknowledge the broader project team, some of whom are sitting behind me today from Resilient Land and Coasts, Community Facilities, Parks and Places and Healthy Waters, our mana whenua partners, the Kaipātiki Local Board, and our supporting consultants. We have a brief presentation for you today just to step through a little bit of a recap of the Shoreline Adaptation Plans, an overview of the Waimanalo Mini Shoreline Adaptation Plan itself, and some of the next steps in the SAP program. So the Shoreline Adaptation Plans are long-term adaptive plans for the sustainable management of Auckland Council-owned land and assets over the next 100 years. They take into consideration the full suite of coastal hazards from coastal erosion, coastal inundation, rainfall flooding, and the impacts of climate change and how that may change the risk profile of those hazards over time. Combined with understanding the cultural values of mana whenua and the values of the local community, this sets the blueprint for some of the high-level adaptation strategies over time that are developed through the process. The Shoreline Adaptation Plans are obviously a key work stream within Te Taruku Atawhiri and align with the Te Ora o Tamaki Makaurau Wellbeing Framework. The whole program has been designed in the spirit of partnership with mana whenua, and through working with the Infrastructure and Environmental Services Kaitiaki Forum, we are guided by a series of operational guiding principles, which includes principles such as being responsive to iwi management plans where available and naturalising the coast where possible. So the work programme itself includes 3 tiers of mana whenua engagement, from regional discussions with the Kaitiaki Forum, local iwi engagement on each area-based plan, and then governance discussions with Te Pōtaio. Coastal management is obviously quite a complex topic, and the Shoreline Adaptation Plan work programme reflects that with a number of key work streams. We have mana whenua engagement, which is end-to-end throughout the development of each Shoreline Adaptation Plan. The community engagement, trialling a range of different methods, both online and in person, to understand the community values and draft that into a series of objectives to support those high-level management strategies. The technical work stream to understand coastal hazards and their risk profile and how that should inform what's technically feasible. And where appropriate, the infrastructure objectives, so particularly working with the council-controlled organisations, Auckland Transport and Watercare, so that any high-level strategies that are put forward align with their objectives. You'll recall from the Whangaparoa pilot that we have 4 overarching adaptation strategies presented for each plan. These are no active intervention, which is essentially allowing natural processes to continue, so no investment in the maintenance or provision of additional coast protection structures. And this is also the strategy that we've been applying for private property, given the current scope of the Shoreline Adaptation Plan work programme. Limited interventions, so this is really related to limited works to extend the life of existing assets, such as maintenance or localised retreat of assets to improve their resilience to coastal hazards over time. And this strategy really acknowledges that the coast is not fixed in a specific location and includes some more nature-based enhancements such as dune planting. And we have Hold the Line, which is really geared towards preserving the function of an area. Implementation options include nature-based options such as beach nourishment or more traditional options such as seawalls. but really the preferred methodology here, aligning with those principles from Mana Whenua, is nature-based options where appropriate. And finally, we have managed realignment, so where we recognise that the risk profile is too high, relocating those assets outside of the hazard zone as far as practicable and allowing that space for coastal processes and reducing our ongoing response costs essentially to coastal hazards and climate change. So to give a brief overview of the Waimanalo Little Shoal Bay Shoreline Adaptation Plan, you'll all be familiar with the location of Little Shoal Bay on the north shore of the Waitemata Harbour. And this bay was selected for prioritising for a mini shoreline adaptation plan due to its value to local iwi, the local communities, and its exposure to coastal hazards both in the present day and over time. What makes this a mini plan as opposed to what you'll be familiar with from the Whangaparoa pilot is its more localised scale, looking at just this one bay, higher resolution in terms of the detail and the results that you'll see in front of you, more focused community engagement methodologies, and a series of overarching high-level adaptation strategies that are supported by a series of current actions in the more immediate term, so the 0 to 3 year sort of time frame. Mana Whenua engagement started before the official launch of the Shoreline Adaptation Plan in October last year, and was undertaken with all local iwi that expressed an interest in the plan's development, which included Ngāti Whanonga, Te Akitai Waiohua, Ngāti Whātua o Ōraki, and Ngāti Pawa. And engagements consisted of a series of approximately 10 online hui, and some of those joint with members of the Kaipātiki local board, and to really understand the Shoreline Adaptation Plan process and the cultural values of this area. And these values have really served as a core foundation to the development of the plan. And this slide is really just to emphasise that some of that higher resolution of the Waimanalo Little Shoal Bay Shoreline Adaptation Plan, so not just focused on the immediate coastal frontage, but extending into the area further upstream, so Area A, including Leroy's Bush and the surrounding environs, and Section B, looking at the cricket pitch and Dudding Reserve. For community engagement on the Waimanalo SAP, this was open from the beginning of the year until the middle of March and looked at a range of different engagement methodologies. So we had digital engagement through the AK Have Your Say platform, an online survey, and we also sought individual submissions. For online engagement, we included an informative webinar for the process of the SAP development process and held 2 facilitated online workshops over multiple times, I think 4 times for each workshop, to understand both the values and objectives for the community at Waimanalo and then translate those through into some of the preferred adaptation strategies. So overall feedback included 405 individual community responses, 19 individual submissions, and each of the facilitated workshops was at full capacity. So here you see an overview of the preferred high-level adaptation strategies across Waimanalo, and I can draw your attention to we have limited intervention for the coastal environments, so looking at the foreshore and the Leroy's Bush area. And this is really going to focus a lot on some of the planting and enhancement that can be done. And then we have hold the line for some of the further landward assets to preserve their functionality and some of those high values recognised through the community in Mana Whenua. Each of these high-level strategies is supported by a series of 6 current actions, and these are to be implemented within existing BAU operational budgets within the more immediate 0 to 3 years, whilst the high-level adaptation strategies really sort of commence from 2025 onwards. One of the most critical current actions within those, or the priority there is to complete some quite complex hydrodynamic modelling to understand the interaction between the saltwater and freshwater environments, which will dictate a lot of the detail of the options that will sit behind these strategies in the implementation phase. So in summary, the Mini Shoreline Adaptation Plan presents a series of high-level strategies for the protection and enhancement of the environment. It adopts the Shoreline Adaptation Plan framework in terms of considering coastal hazards, cultural significant areas and community values. The high-level strategies are supported by those high-level current actions, which is something quite different from what we have in the Whangaparoa pilot. And then obviously specific implementation to implement these high-level strategies will be subject to the regulatory consenting requirements. The Mini Shoreline Adaptation Plan will be embedded within the wider Shoreline Adaptation Plan for Waitemata Harbour when that is scheduled within the programme. And implementation will continue to be a collaborative effort across council, including sort of working these recommendations into supporting plans, particularly the local park management plan for Kaipātiki and coastal asset management planning. And we'll continue to work with Mana Whenua and across the council teams for these implementations. And just to conclude with the work programme and next steps, so we have 20 individual shoreline adaptation plans scheduled to cover the entire 3,200 kilometres of Auckland's coastline. You have previously heard from us with the Whangaparoa pilot, which was completed earlier in the year. Obviously with you today for the Waimanalo Mini Shoreline Adaptation Plan. Anticipate being with you shortly for the Beachlands and East full pilot, second pilot, which is just in the final stages of review with iwi. And we have launched the Awhitu Peninsula and Manukau South Shoreline Adaptation Plans, which began around June. Concurrently with this work, we are completing a regional coastal hazards risk assessment for the entire coast, which will help inform the future rollout of the shoreline adaptation plans around the remainder of the coast. And this regional risk assessment will also support some of the implementation of the SAP. So once all of the coastline is complete, this will help us develop the regional prioritisation schema for the future implementation of each of those high-level strategies. So thank you very much for your time this morning. I'll pass back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, and you can see how comprehensive the work has been and the ongoing work as well. Mayor Goff, first up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I've got a couple of questions, but I'll just create a little bit of context for it, if I may. The default position of local boards, and I'm not just talking about Little Shoal Bay here, we've got 20 of these plans, and this is a mini plan, but the expectations of the local board, the local community and the Mana Whenua will always be to want to hold the line. You know, if I was in that position, that's what I'd want too, because these are assets for the community. But what worries me about the way in which we've set out this strategy is that we create expectations that that will be possible. And I doubt, well, I don't doubt, I know that across 20 shoreline adaptation plans, we won't have 20 plans where the recommendations are overwhelmingly hold the line. Your strategies here, it's important to have the strategy and to do the consultation, but strategies are always theoretical until you know what the costs of your strategy will be and what the source of the revenue will be. We don't know the costs when we adapt the strategy, and we certainly don't know the source of the revenue. So my question is really how can we confidently adopt this strategy without knowledge of the cost and the source of the revenue, and the knowledge that this is not just a one-off, this is one of probably hundreds of mini areas that will be affected by climate change and sea level rise. And I suppose attached to that question is, I can understand in the short term we might be able to hold the line, but we're planning out here the medium term and the long term for 50 and 100 years. That seems to me so desperately theoretical that it has no meaning at all, because we don't know yet whether, if the worst of the climate change happens, we're going to be talking about metres of sea level rise. So why are we going for the longer term and pretending that we have a strategy that's called Hold the Line? And how can we adopt the strategy in good faith until we know what the cost and the source of the revenue will be?
Through the chair, thank you, Mayor Goff. That was a very good question to raise, and there's a few parts of it that we can unpick as we move forward. So I'll start, and we'll work our way through this, and if we need to, we'll come back to some of the main points of your question. I think you led with an expectation that we might expect most communities to desire hold the line. In our experience, that isn't actually correct. So for Whangaparoa, and within that plan, there are large areas that the community, mana whenua, have accepted needs to be retreated and naturalised over time, which is great. Our current experience through Beachlands and East, which is quite a large area of Auckland's coastline, is the same. So communities wanting to explore opportunity and explore the benefits of naturalisation and retreat. In my experience, I've had the benefit of working with council for 22 years. Communities are changing. Their knowledge and appreciation of climate change is evident in what they're bringing forward. There is an appreciation, especially with some of what's happening with respect to reform of the RMA, national policy statements, that it's unacceptable and not achievable to hardline all of Auckland's 3,200 kilometres of coastline, and that's really been backed by our quite intensive and really, I'd like to say, quite amazing engagement and partnership with mana whenua in this space. So I think for Waimanalo, Little Shoal Bay, it is a bit of an anomaly that we're talking about holding the line, so much of holding the line, but I think some of the devil is in the detail for the different parts of Waimanalo and what that means. So it's not speaking to building seawalls everywhere for Waimanalo. It's talking about how we can best manage some of the impacts or changes that we're currently experiencing, what we expect into time. It might involve a little bit of land raising. It might involve a little bit of augmenting some of the drainage requirements in those areas. And that's the sort of work that council does on a pretty regular basis, BAU type of work outside of this type of work. I think it's important as well for council to acknowledge we need to start somewhere with this discussion. And I think what we've been missing for the last, again, in my experience, the last 20 years is a guide that directs council, our communities, in partnership with mana whenua, what we need to plan for, prepare for, and work towards. Funding's a really key part of this, but it will be difficult to have a discussion around the extent of funding required without completing the 20 SAPs, without completing the regional risk assessment, and without updating our asset management plans that sit in and around coastal assets as well. So there's quite a lot of work that's happening behind the scenes of the shoreline adaptation plans. And again, just keeping in mind that the non-statutory living documents which guide the need to think and work towards a certain position, things may change. Mayor Goff, over time, I expect they will. What we're seeing here is guidance based on the best data and science that we have available for now. I have no doubt when we look 100 years forward, things might be quite different to what they are now. So the plans represent our best knowledge and a balance between community desire and how they value the coast and the environs, and what our specialists are confirming needs to be considered and provided for. But you know, there is a huge challenge in this space, and it involves reference to access and critical infrastructure, roading, wastewater, you know, quite a bit to work through in that space. So I think it's important that we can, with confidence, adopt and approve these shoreline adaptation plans, because they are the start of a journey that involves a lot more detailed discussion with communities and asset owners, and ultimately the governing body. You know, discussions that go all the way back to 2017 when we developed the coastal management framework for Auckland. We spoke to a need to complete an exercise such as this to come back and have a more robust discussion around a funding schema. It's timely that the government are also inputting to this conversation at the moment, and thinking about managed retreat and that big, large question of funding and where that sits. But again, the SAPs give us the ability to at least have a position on what we're working towards for most of our coast, and it will not be hold the line. I expect there to be quite the balance between limited intervention, managed retreat, and then some hold the line in those areas where we feel it's appropriate for now.
If I could just focus in on a supplementary, and the supplementary is really about expectations. In the recommendations, we kind of say it. We say where strategies can be implemented through existing budgets, this will be integrated from now. But where strategies require an additional budget, that'll be subject to regional prioritisation. Now, I think that's an accurate statement in the recommendations. But if I was sitting in the community that has an affection for Shoal Bay, and I absolutely understand why they would, I would read this and my expectations would be that you would be able to hold the line on all of that. And I don't know whether we can legitimately raise that expectation at this point until we know what the cost is and until we know where the revenue is coming from. And that's my critical question. And you know, you say things will change over time. Yeah, but my fear is that they'll change, and you say it in the paper in different places, more quickly and for the worse. And we don't know, and government hasn't given any indication of how we deal with that sort of adaptation to sea level rise. So I just reiterate my question. It's around, are we unfairly raising expectations, and particularly that we'll be able to do that for 100 years? I mean, yeah, look, you might be able to hold the line for 20 years, but I couldn't look you in the eye and say in 100 years that will be possible, because I fear for the worse and that it won't be possible. So I really just feel that the paper's a good paper, but it needs to temper expectations with reality. That's my point, and I probably won't take a speaking role because I've already made that point. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Through the chair, maybe just a quick response around maybe some additional clarification that could be added to the report. The current actions that we speak to, or the 6 current actions, are work streams that have been underway for some time, or are envisaged through work programs like our Coastal Assets Renewal work program. So they are. It's fair to raise the expectation in the current actions over the next sort of 3 to 5 years. I think it's important when we talk about the short-term management responses of Hold the Line, that is between 2025 and 2045. So these aren't works that we're envisaging or proposing start tomorrow. There is time to work up the detail in that space. Again, on reflection, when we look towards the long term, it's a discussion that we've had about intimating Hold the Line out that far, that things will change. I guess, again, just want to clarify it's based on our best understanding of the various components of climate change and the impacts for Waimanalo, and our understanding that we could support that management response out to 2085, 2130. But again, as time progresses and the data changes, that may need to be revised. So the Shoreline adaptation plans themselves have a feedback to be revised every 5 or so years, but we've been working with mana whenua to develop another trigger that sits within the SAPs that say it may not be every 5 years, it might be as the circumstance requires. So, you know, in the real world, playing that out for Waimanalo, Little Shoal Bay, a series of infrequent, extremely severe storm events and impacts for that environment would require us to come back and maybe revisit some of the time frames and some of the actions that sit with that. But again, this is our best sort of plan based on what we currently understand, with plenty of opportunity to come back and revise, review.
Thank you, Paul. Member Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That very interesting kōrero just had. My pātai, the plan gives good guidance and good principles for developing management actions. but the concern would be they don't appear able to require these principles to be implemented or ensure ongoing partnership, although that's one of the primary tenets of the plan. So what is the thinking, please, around ensuring and enabling Council's commitment to ensure, in the spirit of partnership, or that the work is ongoing? What is the thinking around it not being just a document, but more it has action attached to it?
Through the Chair, maybe if I could start with this. So we've got a series of current actions, which will be the first phase of implementation of the Waimanalo Shoreline Adaptation Plan. We work closely with the Infrastructure and Environmental Services Kaitiaki Forum, which includes each of the members that has been partnering with us on the Little Shoal Bay Shoreline Adaptation Plan. There's a strong interest from mana whenua, particularly in supporting some of the restoration and environmental enhancement. So we'll be reporting back through the forum on those projects as they become live, and working with the forum and adopting a similar model to what we have for the Shoreline Adaptation Plan itself through to implementation. This will also extend through from the Coastal Renewals Work Programme when we look at specific maintenance and renewal options for some of the structures at Little Shoal Bay. Would you like to add?
Thank you. I guess it still remains that it is only guidance and principles. How do you, enshrines too strong a word, how do you ensure that there is ongoing partnership past this term and moving forward, and that it demonstrates Council's commitment to why we have SAPs in the first place and the need for the partnership? How do you ensure that commitment is evident?
Through the Chair, we've had the benefit through developing the last few SAPs to spend quite a lot of focused time with mana whenua and iwi representatives across Auckland to further that exact discussion. The commitment is there with mana whenua, iwi reps, to develop and co-author the shoreline adaptation plans, and I'm looking forward to bringing the Beachlands and East Plan to the new committee in the new year, because the style and the format of that report is very heavily influenced by mana whenua's inputs, and it speaks to the future need within the partnership space to not only continue consultation around revision of the SAPs as that's required, but also with respect to every action and every piece of work that the SAPs direct. So we have a keen understanding of mana whenua's role in respect of any physical works, any planning that we complete in this space, and I guess outside but supporting the SAPs is an enduring discussion that we are having at the operational forum about how we improve the partnership with mana whenua in the coastal management space with respect to mana whenua and the council family. So we are working through some options and ways to better engage at, for lack of a better way of explaining it, step 0 instead of step 10 of the process. So more discussions around not just engaging with mana whenua when a resource consent application is required or we need feedback, but having mana whenua with us from the start of the journey right through the planning of all of these projects through to delivery. So the Beachlands and East SAP will be easier to speak to and reference that engagement. And as we come back into Waitemata and the broader area for Kapariki and complete that shoreline adaptation plan, you'll see a bit more reference to how we intend to ensure that continues moving forward. So we're putting a lot of time into the partnership at the moment, and rightly so. I would like to say I think that the relationship in this space is a lot better and much improved from a coastal management perspective, and we don't want to lose momentum in that space. So.
Thank you. One last question, if I may, Mr. Chair. The partnership sits at a governance level, and you're talking about INES, which is an operational level. How are you closing the gap on being able to get some decision making through a governance mana whenua forum?
Through the chair, a very good question. I think that's a bit of a broader question that I probably need to come back to members on. There's quite a bit happening in that space. We are focused here on a coastal piece of work, but well aware of the multitude of things that our directorate is progressing. I think there needs to be a better connection with the governance level and some better clarity around when and how we engage at the governance level versus when and how we engage at an operational level, and then how we take that guidance and engage with iwi on the ground. I think my experience is there's still a little bit of a disconnect through some of those levels, from governance through to operations to on the ground, and some of the local meetings, wānanga, that we have. So I know there's a bit of work happening in that space. Currently, we're happy to contribute to that. Just a reminder, in this space for the SAPs, we have been up and through governance, through the operational, more regular engagement in huis, and we find ourselves at the moment having more on the ground engagement. And we've just come out of a wānanga yesterday, Tuesday actually, at Omapui Marae with Naitaki Tamaki, reinforcing some of those more focused discussions. But yeah, I think the best I can do is support that there needs to be a bit of a better guide as to governance through operations to on the ground work, and yeah, I'm happy to be part of that conversation.
Thank you. Look, just in the spirit of being helpful, the Secretariat, IMSP, is always available to aid and support in whatever manner you see fit. Thank you for your answers.
Kia ora.
Thank you, Member Wilson. Councillor Cooper.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the report. I have similar concerns as the Mayor in terms of the plan. I wondered whether it was an opportunity, these plans, to actually have that wider discussion, because in the end, we probably won't be able to hold the line. And hold the line might have natural responses, but also things like building seawalls are really expensive and they don't last forever. So has there been a thought around these plans where we start to have that wider conversation? Because you said that further work needs to be done on things like infrastructure, like roading, pipes, etc., parks, because maybe they'll have to be moved, you might need to find new places. Is it better to actually be saying in these plans that this is actually temporary? Because it is, isn't it? If we have sea level, that's what I'm concerned about. And I've got another question as well, but I just, these are not permanent fixes. They are holding the line, is holding it until we can't hold it anymore. But my concern is that we give this expectation that we'll just keep holding the line forever. And my experience has been, in one of my areas, the community hated it when it was the local board said, let's go for natural realignment. They said, no, you've got to build the wall. And they had to build the wall. Great expense.
Through the chair, another great question, and it does speak to the need to spend more time in the space of council's role and affordability with respect to coastal management, especially for Auckland. We have the benefit of being part of the broader discussions in this space across New Zealand with other councils, also through the New Zealand Coastal Society. This is a really hot topic, and I want to reinforce the fact that the SAPs are a non-statutory living document for that very reason. The SAPs are structured in a way that they can be revised, they can be adjusted as more and better data and information comes online. But I feel, having reflected on Mayor Goff's question and your question, Councillor Cooper, I really feel, and I look forward to being able to have a broader discussion around affordability and how we prioritise our responses as a council to our communities of Auckland. But we do need to have in place certain key information and reports. And I just want to reiterate that the SAPs, again, the 20 SAPs is only one part of what we need to have, or to be able to present and discuss to inform the funding requirement affordability discussion. So it's not only the SAPs, but we need to complete the regional risk assessment for Auckland. You've heard Natasha speak to that. That's a way of that's a way of evaluating and assessing natural hazard risk, climate change risk, and how it impacts the different areas of Auckland in different ways. That will give us an ability to look at where we need to focus our efforts when we apply the SAP overlays as well. That looks at a range of social, economic, social deprivation, extent of development, proximity of development factors, and we're very close with completing that piece of work. It's a huge undertaking for Tamaki Makaurau when you look at the extent of our coastline. But we also need to complete a revision to our asset management plans in this space. I think it's fair to say our asset management plans for coastal assets and assets within the coastal environment could be improved. So we're committed to actually updating those plans over the next year or two, and those AMPs the updates to those AMPs will be supported by other work that's happening in this space as well, Councillor Cooper. So things like areas of Auckland susceptible to coastal erosion, and that piece of work that we completed a year or two ago. We've just committed to a new piece of work around rerunning our LIDAR for Auckland's coast, so some more oblique LIDAR around our coast that'll give us a better appreciation of the current state of our coast and help inform the current state of our assets. We shouldn't discount that SAPs sit at a very high level and direct the need to do more of what we're discussing today, but we need some more of the focused information and data to really lean into the discussion around affordability. We are only currently really getting a handle on the state of our coastal assets. It's a reasonable asset base as well. So whilst we plan for the future and what we need to do, we also need to have one hand on our current requirements as an asset owner. We're talking about $1.1 billion worth of coastal assets with a reasonably small renewal budget of $10 million a year. So there is a discussion that we need to have in that space. And working with my team, what we're proposing to do is actually come back to the relevant committee in the new year after elections and have a bit more of a workshop in this space based on what we know about what we currently own and risk that our current assets are subject to, what the revised data is telling us from a need to prepare better into the future perspective. And by that time as well, we would have hopefully completed another 2 shoreline adaptation plans, so we'll have a bit more of a broader Auckland to speak to. But again, just my final point, the trend that I'm seeing through the SAPs that are complete at Whangaparoa and Beach and East is much more of a trend leaning towards managed realignment and limited intervention, not a one-trick pony from a hold the line, build seawalls. I really am seeing a change in our communities, and especially through mana whenua leading, a lot more reference to wanting to work with nature and not fight against nature. I think it's timely we're having the discussion now with where the SAPs are and where central government is with progressing some of their thinking as well, because I think it's all going to come together at about the right time. But we're not shying away from the challenge ahead. I can't give the answers around exactly how much this is going to cost and who pays. And just a reminder, this is a conversation focused on public land and public assets. There's another big piece to this, which is private land, private assets, how that's managed, and council's role as a regulator in that space as well. The SAPs, where they can seek to show that council can walk the talk in many respects, in respect of doing what we should be doing more of, which is working with the environment. That is always our preference. Maybe I should have led with that, actually, just a bit of clarification around coastal practitioners currently are always looking for options to work with nature, not necessarily against it. And when we talk about seawalls or hold the line, they often come with a tag in and around useful life and consent duration, which is getting less and less over time as well.
Thank you. And just a supplementary, Mr. Chair. So I think you're probably right in general. People are realising that, you know, we need to go more with nature, but the rub comes when it's private property, understandably. Now, the other question just is with recommendation C3 around it being a regional prioritisation process, were there any discussions with local board as local landowners for a lot of this land and parks and the ability to make the decisions for those areas around striking a local rate to supplement any regional budget, given the importance to local communities?
Through the chair, those discussions have come up. I think it's probably fair to say that boards generally would make reference to looking to the governing body to help lead some of the regional discussion in this space. Rates, targeted rates, have been raised. I think some of the boards that we've worked with have had the experience, or some of the members that have been in and around council for quite some time have had the experience of applying targeted rates for things that relate to coastal management. It hasn't gone down very well in the past, so they're a little bit not willing to lead that discussion, but probably in general more of a reference to looking to the regional position on council's approach and affordability. So we haven't really landed that or gone too deep with that conversation.
Thank you.
The board did consult on a targeted rate in the 10-year budget, but it was pretty high level. It said stop flooding or something in Little Shoal Bay, and the feedback was mixed, and so the local board didn't progress anything from there. Deputy Mayor.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Paul and team, for your work. This is not easy stuff, is it? We've got the sea level rising, and we've also got the tectonic plates pushing the west coast up and the east coast down. And that's actually having a far greater effect than sea level rise, quite frankly, to a multiple between 5 and 10. My concern here, and I'll be absolutely honest about it, is the equity and consistency. You've got a large chunk of hold the line from cricket pitches, abutments, road reserve, beachfronts, and a boatyard. Whereas in truth, Little Shoal Bay's at sea level anyway, virtually, been there a few times. And I'm concerned that the equity part and the precedent part is not reflected thoroughly enough in this report. And a lot of people, other people with assets such as Imapura and Marae, the coastal park assets at Maraetai, White Patch, the clifftop parkland and houses at Beachlands, which are going to end up in the tide, the Fitu Peninsula and coastlines, they all have expectations of hold the line for the next 50, 60, 75 years. And the reality is that's just not going to be affordable. You can talk about producing budgets as much as you like, but it's just not, people will not, this community, which is relatively well off, did not want to do a targeted rate. Council's got to fix, and so everyone's got to pay. But the quantum of this is so great, I just do not see how it can be done. I really don't. So my question to you, have you considered the equity lens and the pragmatic fairness and precedent setting when this report was put forward? And I commend you for it, but I'm having trouble with it.
Through the chair, yes, we have. I think the piece I spoke to around the regional risk assessment especially speaks to some of the equity considerations, socio-economic considerations. I think the line of questioning in this space relates to a local community and some of what's been most desired for this local community, but I need to balance that with some of the influence with the technical specialists that have been involved with this as well. So there is a blend for the Waimanalo report around what we think is practical, achievable, and appropriate for this location. Not necessarily overly influenced by community demand. This process followed the same process as every SAP, which was to engage with community and mana whenua in a way that we explored values and use. And I think the discussions in this space helped us understand the range of use across not only the local community and the local residents for Waimanalo, but also we had a very good appreciation now of those that come to this location for that use. So when we talk about holding the line in this instance for Waimanalo, I'd like us to move away from thinking of just seawalls and hard defences, which are expensive to build, expensive to maintain, and not easily justifiable, we're talking about a range of options here. We're talking about the treatment of drainage systems. We're talking about bunding and sculpting of land levels, which are already augmented because it's reclamation in the back of Waimanalo. So we're also not giving necessarily, and I know that might not be coming across in the long-term management strategy, an indication that things will be that way forever. And Natasha talked to a very important point in the current actions, or the short-term actions that we've committed to over 2022 to 2025. That complex modelling that we want to do to understand the interface between freshwater and saltwater, sea inundation and flooding will give us a better guide as to what can be achieved, and possibly will guide some influence on the medium and longer term management responses here as well. So we're missing that piece of work. It's a pretty detailed piece of work. But equity and fairness, same type of conversation we're having across all of Auckland. And it's nice that you mentioned Umapuia Marae, and that's exactly where we've just come from, and we understand a lot of the issues really well in Beachlands and East. And the original intent was to bring both SAPs to today's committee. Unfortunately, there's just a little bit of, well, not unfortunately, the requirement is just for a little bit more engagement between Ngāi Taumaki, Tamaki and Ngāti Pawa. So we're just working through a little bit of the cultural inputs for that plan. When you read that report, you'll see quite a lot of reference to retreat, naturalisation, realignment, and hold the line, not just for areas where there is a specific need for critical infrastructure, but also to better help protect and manage sites of cultural significance. So I'm not seeing a distinction or disparity with how we're engaging with communities and what's coming through in the plans. I think it's fair to say for Little Shoal Bay, Waimanalo, probably the highest level of input for any coastal project in my 20 years. So just a huge amount of interest in respect of what council might be thinking of actioning in that space. So quite a bit of misinformation circulated, but yeah, I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing equity in the way that the process is undertaken. But I acknowledge again, and I'd be the first to admit, the discussion around affordability, funding, and risk for council is real. It is a really, really meaty conversation. I think I had the benefit, Councillor Cashmore, of quite early discussions in 2018, 2019, when these sorts of discussions were raised around affordability and funding and what was required of council. The instruction that I received was, when you come back to lead that conversation, we want to see good information, good data, and good research, because at the time we were having a discussion about the level of asset renewal funding, coastal renewal funding that was required. And we did have that discussion and sought that level of funding with a bit of a rider that it was based on some pretty high level information, but we needed to go a little bit deeper. And I see SAPs as an important piece of what we need to bring back to the committee to help drive these conversations. And keep in mind that the SAPs will be completed. They will instruct and map a variety of management strategies over timeframes. But when we have the broader discussion about overlaying some of the funding, it won't discount our ability to say, and using the regional risk assessment as a guide to say, this is where council's going to prioritise its spend. It's going to be here, and it's going to be there, and it's going to be over here, but it might not be, equally spread across the region, and that's just the nature of what we need to consider. Not all of Auckland, luckily enough, is subject to urgent and immediate risk. That means we've got the time to work through these conversations. There are other areas of New Zealand that don't have the time, and they're grappling right here, right now with these sorts of discussions, and that they're coming up with recommendations, decisions, and levels of funding that I would say are informed by not as robust thinking and research as we're trying to complete here.
Natasha, did you have something to add?
Oh, yes, if I may, through the chair, I just wanted to, and I hope this will help answer your question somewhat, but I just wanted to reflect on the lessons learnt. Waimanalo has been unique in that it's been a mini shoreline adaptation plan, and I think some of the lessons learnt through that are the challenges of looking at a site-specific area. It has prompted a lot more focus on the detail of the specific assets and their function within Waimanalo, in contrast to the wider Shoreline Adaptation Plan programme where we're looking at large coastal cells. I think that enables, from my perspective, some balance in terms of what we're looking at in the context of the regional risk assessment. So that I think has been really useful to learn and understand through looking at the full pilots that we've had and the mini shoreline adaptation plan for Waimanalo.
Thank you. Thank you, Natasha. You must have read my mind because I was about to say that. And I think that's important for the questions coming up, is that this is probably going to be one of the only, at this stage, mini quite focused plans. So Whangaparoa, Beachlands, Maraetai, they're quite large, and there will be bits like Little Shoal Bay and all of those larger studies that will be hold the line, but there'll be parts in the Kaipatiki Upper Harbour sort of overall plan that comes in the next couple of years that will be managed retreat and different parts of that. It's just that this, because there was so much interest, we pushed forward to have a look at a mini plan to give those more direct answers. So it looks like there's a lot more hold the line, but this is because it's such a small focused area with so many assets like a road and recreation and a bunch of other things too. I'll probably add more in my speaking turn, but I think it also that there was members of the community that wanted far more structures put in place to hold back seawater, etc., and the team have been very clear that is not the intention. And some of the other things in here, it's about the nuisance flooding. There isn't actually at the moment solutions for the overall larger king tides and storms and things like that. So it's trying to find that balance at the moment. Councillor Darby.
Thanks. Look, I think we've sort of canvassed this, and I think I've got my head around it, but I'm looking at the C round 1 and 2. So there's going to be a lot of expectation once we approve this today. There's expectation that under that C1 that council will be doing something quite quickly, but that's possibly not the case. So can you just, I understand the wording there, it's about integrating the adaptive strategies into the asset management plans. Is there an assumption there that when you do that within existing budgets, you are also making available those budgets for physical works? And is that C1 ahead of resolving the other shoreline adaptation plans, and in the absence of a prioritisation process?
Through the chair, just to clarify, table 2 within your notes there for the shoreline adaptation plan, it does speak to current actions, and I think that's causing a little bit of confusion in this space. Not only is Waimanalo as a mini SAP slightly different to normal SAPs, within this SAP we've also agreed to some current actions, and the reason that we've done that is the current actions reflected here speak to some of what was being raised when we were having the discussion for the SAP, but it related to work that was either underway or planned to start. It was already captured in the Coastal Asset Renewals Work Programme. It was always already being envisaged by Customer Community Services for some of how they're managing the sports field or park areas in that space. So table 2 and the list of those 6 actions and the reference to utilising current budgets, just to explain that a little bit better, there's a range of commitment across my department, Healthy Waters, Customer and Community Services, to do some work that is already envisaged, already within their work programs, already budgeted for, either OPEX or CAPEX as part of other things that are happening. We thought it was just really important to capture those current actions for a couple of reasons. I think that they were what was being raised in that space was becoming a little bit of a distraction to engaging with community and mana whenua around some of the longer term planning and visioning. A lot of the community wanted to come back and talk about, but what's happening with the stairs? What's happening with the little groin? What's happening with our seawall? So we've captured them in that list, put them to the side, clarified that there is funding to progress a lot of that work, either the planning and design or right through from the planning design and actually implementation. So you'll see reference in point or item 5 around the seawall and inundation. That is a project already in the Coastal Asset Renewals Work Program that we're mid-flight on or engaged doing the design. So I think the other point there is to complete the SAP, complete the planning and the thinking, and complete the AMP, so that can again better inform some of the future funding decisions, requirements.
Yeah, that's a lot clearer, thanks.
Thank you. And last question, Councillor Watson.
Just want to pick up on the officer's comments to do with striking a balanced and a practical approach. And I say this in the context of having been through the Whangaproa pilot, where, as Paul Kleinak has said, you know, huge big parts of Whangaproa essentially just left to natural processes. In any given area, though, Paul, and I think particularly of Little Shoal Bay here, where you have, you know, an accumulation of council assets, you know, in this case we've got the only other major road that other than Ottawa Road that links into Birkenhead and Birkdale and Beach Haven, you know, playgrounds, sports fields, tennis courts, you know, walks, etc., etc. It surely means that in those areas, opposed to some of the other coastal areas where you don't have the concentration of council assets, where you don't have the population using them, then inevitably it requires a different assessment and a different weighing up of priorities, and that, you know, that priorities will become clearer over the passage of time, whether something is imminent, whether it might have a 10, 20, 30-year lifespan. So all those sort of details surely have to be fed into any decision-making process like this. Whereas for some areas, it's not an issue because you don't have that, you know, value to the community concentrated on a whole number of fronts in the one area. So am I right in assuming that with the passage of time, this sort of information and analysis will then be much better able to feed into the various weighing up of whether, you know, X amount of dollars goes here or it doesn't, but that if you don't do this work, if you don't assess some different layers of value, then you're kind of leading yourself down the wrong path in terms of saying, well, you know, everywhere's the same, everyone has the same value. It doesn't. That these sorts of pockets are quite identifiable and quite different from huge other parts of the coastline. Is that a reasonable summation?
Through the chair, kia ora, Councillor Watson. Yes, that is a fair observation and comment, and I think that's accurate. You know, Tamaki Makaurau is an extraordinarily complex area to have a hand in managing. Our communities are quite diverse, very different in their needs and requirements. And I think some of the future challenge, I was just thinking to myself, the difference between somewhere like Tamaki Drive versus the Umapuia Coast Road, for example. You know, decisions need to be made in and around in time about how we manage that type of infrastructure and that type of access. In some locations, it might be a slightly easier discussion because we've got the ability to relocate infrastructure, reroute roads, for example. In other environments, it's going to become increasingly challenging. And I think the trap that we don't want to fall into, or that we want to make sure that we have an adequate trigger developed in, is you can only hold the line and you can only manage against nature for so long. And the SAPs are trying to find and acknowledge that in the future, often. Management responses need to change, but importantly, we need to work with our different communities around what those triggers are to enact that change. And yeah, that's complex and it's tricky. But I think that the SAPs give us the baseline to move into more detailed discussions around more detailed projects, and I think that will become clearer over time.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. And probably last question from me, and thank you for taking my calls and feedback and concerns on this for some time. And I think, isn't the purpose and the reason why we funded this through the 10-year budget to stop, because we are funding lots of coastal assets in an ad hoc way right now. This is not a plan to do stuff. We're already kind of funding things without a strategy or plan. And this is the whole intention, is that slowly we'll figure out what we need to protect and what we can't. Because we're not going to let everything go all at once, but so I guess confirmation that isn't this why we're doing these plans and why we funded them? Because they weren't funded 2 years ago. There was none of this work that could be done.
No, that's through the chair. That's a very good point, a very important point. I think what the SAPs give council from a coastal management practitioner perspective is, for the first time, when Auckland's coastline experiences not just the incremental effects of climate change, which are a little harder to see on a day-to-day basis, but more importantly after an infrequent severe storm event. And I had the privilege of travelling Auckland's east coast with Mayor Goff after a pretty severe storm event a few years ago, community to community, having discussions around what had happened, why we thought it had happened in that way, and the magnitude of that storm event. And it was quickly followed by a line of questioning around, so what are you going to do about this? And what is council's plan? And we've never had the ability to pick up something that's like a SAP to say, actually, we've got a shoreline adaptation plan for this area. It talks about coastal processes. It talks about incremental change. It talks about effects of infrequent storm events. And guess what? In the short term, it envisages that we might need to, for example, retreat an area of our coastline. And if we had that plan in place, and we'd work through those discussions with our communities and mana whenua, and we wanted to retreat or naturalise a part of the coastline, and we were having a discussion on site where a seawall had failed, and this happened multiple times on the tour down the east coast, I would have been able to refer to the SAP and say, look, we're not going to rebuild that asset, we're actually going to remove that asset and we're going to naturalise. And the SAP supports that approach, and also the SAP outlines the community's support, mana whenua's support to go down this road. So it is a massive leap forward from a coastal management perspective to obviate and reduce a lot of the ad hoc knee-jerk responses. It's been really, really tough for us as engineers and scientists leading some of these discussions with the community, resisting our advances to want to retreat and naturalise a bit of coastline without saying, where's the evidence, where's the data, you haven't talked to us, where's the conversation? So yeah, SAPs fit into that space, and yeah, will provide a really important guide and foundational approach.
Thank you. That's the end of questions. So I'll get you both to move away from the table so you're not entering into the debate, but just want to acknowledge all of you and your teams for the significant work, not just on Waimanalo, Little Shoal Bay, but I know that it's really ramping up, but actually getting evidence and community and all, and working in partnership with mana whenua, while also dealing with complex laws that continue to change as you roll these out. So thank you. Right, I've moved this, and Councillor Darby has seconded. Seconded? Is that correct wording? Yes. I'll go straight to Councillor Watson for speaking turn.
Yeah, I'd really just like to endorse the approach that the officers have recommended to us with respect of Little Shoal Bay. It's not in my ward, of course, but I am familiar with this approach in respect of what's happened with the Whangaproa pilot, which again what involved a lot of communication with the community, but unlike the instance here with Little Shoal Bay, it was quite a different response that came back in terms of what was the the most appropriate way forward in the future. In instances like this one, where we're moving more towards site-specific adaptive strategy, I think it's really important that you actually take some sense of what those particular assets are, that and specifically when they are concentrated, as is the case here, where we have a very major roading network that goes through there, and that in terms of the transport network is really important as a backup to Onawa Road. We have sports fields, we have a very significant playground and picnic spot that serves a much wider area than just Northcote and Birkenhead. We have a bowling club, we have tennis court, we have basketball court, etc., etc. And what we have just over the rise is a massive intensification occurring in the Northcote area in terms of Kaingaora and other residential development. So that hugely growing community, Little Shoal Bay is an access point to the coast, to those facilities, the nearest one, and connected by a very expensive cycleway that was put in a few years ago. So in those instances, then obviously a more pragmatic, balanced approach needs to be taken in terms of weighing up the relative value and investment that may or may not be needed in any given timeline. So, I think that balance has been struck in this instance. And as I said, the adaptation plans will vary quite markedly from area to area, and as a consequence, so will the investment. But the notion that you might just sort of say, oh well, this is coming, it's too big, we can't afford this, we can't afford that. Well, that's really not going to be reflected in site-specific examinations as occurred here, as to A, what has to be done, and B, the value of protecting what is already there for whatever length of time might seem more accurate at that stage. So I guess, Mr. Chair, it's a long way round of saying that, I think this is a pretty thorough report and recommendation that's been presented to us today, and I think in respect of Little Shoal Bay, it's certainly one that is striking the right balance at this stage, and that that should be continued as a result. And similarly, when other areas come up from the other adaptation studies, then there'll be either a kind of Whangaproa type approach, or there might be a Little Shoal Bay type of approach. But I don't think it's not the one size fits all. It's got to be site specific. There's got to be this sort of evaluation. Otherwise, we'll end up with some perverse outcomes. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. I will round up if you wanted to speak.
Look, just briefly, I think a lot has been covered here, and I acknowledge the work that's been done here by Paul and Natasha, and they've done it with mana whenua, and they will continue to do it with mana whenua as well. And I think there's an enormous opportunity here for us as a council to take that cultural perspective and get much better outcomes for Auckland. But look, I just want to say, Chair, I know this is, in your patch and my patch. I just want to acknowledge your work in getting this work up. I wouldn't suggest that, the Waimanalo project has got any jump start on all the others that are in the adaptation plan list. It's just that this one has already had a lot of life to it, and it had a lot of community engagement. I want to acknowledge the local board for their participation in this. And then there's been some real passionate environmentalists, that is, other than yourself, Chair. People like Kyle Aitken, who's been emailing us for quite a few years now, really engaged. So people like that, and there are others as well, which I won't run through the names. But look, we have a situation here where there's been inundation for years and it's going to be accelerated now at a real rate of knots, nautical knots. While I'm happy to see, the response in the different categories, I can't help but think it's going to change quite dramatically as well as we get into it, and the Mayor's alluded to that. But look, you can't go spending money willy-nilly unless you have a strategy, this is the first of a number. This is going to be a very challenging course for the council. It's going to be enormously challenging, but there is terrific creative opportunity here as well. I think this is going to bring the best out of our thinking on how we can adapt. And I think natural processes are going to really come to the fore like never before. But thanks, Chair, thanks for your work on this, and it's a very early starting block outcome, this one.
Kia ora, thank you, Councillor Darby. Last speaker before me, Mayor Goff.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I'll keep it brief because I've made some of the points already. Look, I first of all want to thank Paul and Natasha and the team. There's a hell of a lot of work gone into this, and thank you for reminding me of the trip that we did around the coast. And it was that trip and my knowledge of that area that the Deputy Mayor talked about that indicates to me the scale of what climate change and rising sea levels is going to mean. And I don't think there is yet in our wider community an appreciation of that scale and of the cost. And we're not just talking about the public assets that are part of this paper, but as Paul alluded to, we're talking about private property and private assets, and that will run into billions of dollars. And neither the government nor the communities nor we have worked out yet how we're going to deal with that. And it is a reality. It's happening now, and we have to deal with it. So absolutely endorse the idea of having a shoreline adaptation plan. You cannot deal with this in an ad hoc way, so you have to do it across the board. I have no problem with that. We need a strategy, we need an overview to determine where we're going to hold the line, where we're going to have, it's a new name now, I think, managed realignment. It used to be called retreat, but that has the sense of a military defeat, so we've probably changed the name accordingly, and where we might need limited intervention. But I go back to my original point, Mr. Chair, and when we have these discussions with our communities, it is really important that we do not raise unrealistic expectations, because I'm pleased that some of the acknowledgement among communities is that yes, we cannot, I think you used the term, you've got to work with nature, not against it. But it still seems to me that where there is private property involved, people will have the anticipation that council should be on the front line of protecting their property against rising sea levels. And kind of a King Canute comes to mind there. We can do some things, we will have to do some things, but there are a whole lot of things that we won't be able to do. So can I just urge two things? One, when we have the discussions with communities, we do raise the issue of this isn't unique to their community, it's right across the city and right across the country. We've got to work out what the costs are, we will have to prioritise, and we need to know where the revenue's coming from. Because the targeted rate proposal that you referred to, Mr. Chair, yeah, look, everybody wants to go to heaven and nobody wants to die. Everybody wants to have that protection put in place, but we all know actually the only place that revenue comes from is from us as ratepayers and taxpayers. And I would just urge, on the slide there, the impression that when you say hold the line medium and long term, talking about 100 years, and then it says delivery will be accommodated by existing budgets. I think that's a little misleading. We need to say, actually, we've got to think long term, but we have no idea whether we will be able to hold the line longer term, and actually, on the balance of probabilities, we won't be able to. So when we do the short term investment, we need to make sure that it's not so short term that sooner or later we'll spend the money and then we have to abandon the project. So, thank you very much for all the work that's gone into it. I'll be supporting the paper, but I have those caveats that I hope you take on board. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora, thank you, Mayor Goff. There are no more speakers, so I'll just finish up on this. I do want to acknowledge, first of all, mana whenua for being so engaged in this process and being engaged constantly through the other shoreline adaptation plans so far. It is only going to work across our coast if we ensure we're working in partnership with mana whenua and the original, kaitiaki of these spaces are restored, because when we're talking about the environment and many of the ideas mana whenua have had for centuries is quite a bit different than physical infrastructure, which, as we've seen through that storm Mayor Goff talks about, I think it was 150 slips and assets that were smashed apart in that 2017-18 time, and that's just on public land. So this is why the teams involved have been so passionate about the shoreline adaptation plans, because we need to plan, because we are spending millions of dollars each year on fixing, addressing, removing, replacing coastal assets that, in a couple of years later are getting smashed again by the next large storm. This is slightly different than the other plans, and the reason is because we went for the mini shoreline adaptation plan here because of the interest, because of the many requests, because of the confusion, because of the ad hoc nature, and sometimes the conflicting nature of projects and requests in the Waimanalo Little Shoal Bay area. So it was crucial before we did any more actions that we got this up over the line before we continue to spend money on trying to patch up little bits. The other thing, if you've been to Little Shoal Bay, not all of it is inundated, not all of it is underwater. There are actually the eastern side and a lot of the recreation areas, playground, different parts of the bay which are not at risk anytime soon. They're quite considerably higher than other parts. It's confusing. A lot of people think when there's the high tides or rain that it's always seawater that floods, but often it's actually stormwater inundation from the back and the low-lying areas that fill up. So it's not a simple thing of putting up a magical seawall, because then you're probably going to create a bathtub effect of the whole reserve too. So it's ensuring we're thinking about all the water, whether it's coming in or going out, or as we find when there's storms, we often get high tides at the same time, and you've created that bathtub anyway. The community have been really passionate, very vocal, which is awesome. It's very good that we have a community that is willing to speak up for what it wants to protect. Not all those views were shared with each other, but I think it's been a great process for the community to listen to each other, understand mana whenua, understand the laws coming through, like the MPS, freshwater, and what we can and cannot do in that space. There was some concern and maybe slight misinformation that there was a suggestion that council were going to turn the space into something such as a wetland or a mangrove swamp. That was never the case, but it did have to be part of the discussion. The staff were very transparent about what the future could look like. It wasn't simply turning something into something, but it might be what we do to protect or not protect certain areas. It is crucial that we protect the wetlands. There aren't many wetlands left in our city, both saltwater and freshwater, and those are huge for climate benefits, mitigation, but also the species that we do not have in many of our bays and shores anymore that are present in Waimanalo Little Shoal Bay. There is an extra focus here, and we will see when we do the full shoreline adaptation plan for this area, there will be areas where we do not and cannot protect anymore. But when we think of Little Shoal Bay, it is a multifaceted community benefit. You've got the access road, you've got recreation space, you've got playgrounds, you've got access to the water, you've got some of the most interesting ecological habitat on the shore at least, but maybe even Tamaki Makaurau, that does need protection, it does need focus. So I guess that is why this is important, to hold the line in certain areas, but also the community now know we are not going to be building massive structures to protect things which actually have adverse effects. But we will still be managing, we'll still be upgrading, we'll still be improving the assets in that area and trying our best to improve that space, while also acknowledging, I think when people know when king tides and storms hit during king tides, there isn't a lot we can do right across Auckland in that space. I want to acknowledge the local board. I know there was some concern from the local board about what this meant at the beginning, but they've worked really in partnership with the staff, mana whenua, the community, to get the results. And I know maybe not everything they wanted was locked in here, but they've been, and as you hear from Chair John Gillen, they've been very happy with the process and the conclusion and the outcomes going forward. I think I understand the questions and the concerns from the committee about what the expectations the community will have very long term, but I think that is a constant conversation that will be had. But with what the information we have now, this is a very clear, well thought out plan that is protecting all the parts that I think the community largely want to protect in this area. I want to thank the Mayor and the councillors and IMSB members for the budget. I mean, I remember Paul discussing this. I kept saying, why aren't we doing this, that, and the other? And you were very clear to me that, well, we didn't have the budget to do it, and it's very complex. So to get those climate initiatives into the 10-year budget during what was a very, very difficult time for our finances, we saw this as a priority, and everyone, nearly everyone around our table supported that budget getting in to look at the public land. Private land and through the adaptation plan from government is going to be another conversation altogether, but at least this makes it clear where our priority is and ensuring we don't waste money without a plan patching up our coastline. So that's all I have to say on that. I'm really excited about what comes next. It's a shame that we couldn't get the Beachlands, Maraetai, SAP up today, but I understand there's a bit more work to do. Mana whenua are keen to get this right as well. So that will come in the next month or two or to the next committee, and that's the important thing. We don't want to rush these things either, but that would have given a bit more context to what the overall areas are like, as well as mini ones like this. So, kia ora, thank you very much. I will go all those in favour.
Aye.
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 Is there anyone opposed?
Aye.
No. Thank you very much. Awesome. We will move to a 5-minute break. I've got some cake and lollies and things for the last committee if anyone would like to grab some. Go to the bathroom, have a cup of tea, and we'll see you in, well, 10 minutes. 5 minutes. Thank you.